over the process, it pushed me to think a little bit about oppression and the lack of honesty when it comes to discussions that are as complicated and difficult as oppression. Oftentimes, we've seen people with privileges talking about people without privileges. And even though many people don't want to do that, just the outcome results in underlying the very severe conflicts. So I think that has changed drastically in the entire process. And I'm very happy that happened because it allowed me to be more honest, and it allowed me to incorporate a lot of elements in the film that talk about the point of view of the oppressor, that it is the oppressor who is responsible for the oppression.
Welcome to the Future Money podcast presented by the Interledger Foundation, where we invite people of all backgrounds and disciplines to imagine what a financially inclusive future might be. I'm Hollis Wong-Ware, a community ambassador with the Interledger Foundation.
I am Nabil Karama, program officer at the Interledger Foundation.
This season, we're focusing on the creative arts. And in this episode, we are in conversation with Subhashish Panigrahi. He's a civil society leader and documentary filmmaker with an interest in tech, media, and society.
His films focus on conservation and assertion and a broader issue of access, digital rights, and openness.
He advocates for community-led media, open tech development, and indigenous sovereignty. Subhashish will be sharing about his film Bringing Down a Mountain, what inspired him to create the project, his passion for language, and how this film highlights digital exclusion and his vision for a financially equitable future.
Hey, Subhashish, welcome to our podcast. We're so happy to have you here. We wanted to start out with where you grew up. I heard that you grew up in a rural environment.
I grew up in a rather plural environment, but an environment that's also kind of complex. My community was the dominant community among the 3-4 different communities, and the indigenous communities were historically oppressed. And I saw that while growing up in many ways, be it education, be it just social behavior. And I think I got very interested in languages quite early. And somehow my career also helped expanding those interests, or it probably happened naturally that I got into jobs and started volunteering in different communities that were around languages. And I think,
how many indigenous communities were there in the region where you grew up?
At least 2-3 different indigenous communities, but there were minorities, and their existence was erased in many ways by my community.
You say that with some pain in your heart.
Yeah.
Why do you believe that your people were part of the disappearance of the other communities?
For several years, India has this very hierarchical caste system where people are pushed into doing particular jobs. People that are more dominant, their languages are given a higher preference. They obviously are taught in schools. They are spoken in the larger society, whereas people that are either minorities or are minoritized in their own sort of geopolitical situations, environments, their languages are oppressed. I think those are the realities I grew up with.
Thank you so much for sharing that insight. I would love for you to zoom out a little bit and share with us just a general background about you and your journey to becoming a documentary filmmaker that is now part of the Future Money cohort.
For sure. I was quite involved in the Wikimedia movement that helped me find a job at the Wikimedia Foundation. That was kind of my first real job after I graduated. That work left a very lasting impact because I not only saw how languages are used in different contexts and the language politics that is behind the use of languages, but also the larger connection that languages have. So it's very interesting to navigate the whole space. And I think that made me very interested in learning about societies and how they use languages, and also document in that process. That got me a grant from the National Geographic Society And I did 3 documentaries, 2 from my own homestead, and then 1 from Nepal. Doing those 3 films were very interesting because it helped me connect with a lot of communities that I wouldn't have connected otherwise. And eventually the films became resources for the community. So they started using the films and the footage for language promotion and their own language documentation work.
Your documentation created a new pathway for the language.
It did contribute positively in many different ways. Uday and I worked together. Uday, who is this researcher who has been studying the language for a long time, has been working with the community elders, and is very much passionate about keeping the language alive. And right after we finished the film, he actually approached the Nepal Language Commission and told them that somebody from India came and documented the language, and we should do something about this language that is still alive. And he got a support from them. And I think with that money, he built this education program.
That's
wow, that's so profound. And I think I'm just kind of thinking about your trajectory as well. So I'm wondering if you could tell us more about your transition into filmmaking. What was that like for you, and what really drove that? Why did you see filmmaking as like the next step for you to move from the Wikimedia community and kind of that digitally based, archival community into really art making and making generative creativity?
I think for me, I've always been interested in building media and creating media that is more tangible, that is more useful in some way. I saw the catalytic role that I could play through my work, through my activism, through my everyday life, that I developed skills that could be useful in different ways. And I think languages particularly are not documented the way they should be documented. So one really has to be very, very careful about their approach and how they do things. And I think it's as complicated and as tricky as it gets, especially when it comes to practical documentation, because a lot can be done in theory and a lot can be written in a very righteous way. But when it comes to doing things practically in the field, it just isn't that easy. So I think the process itself is very slow. And I think I enjoyed that process.
Is that also the approach you've taken with the Future Money application?
Absolutely. And I think this project is probably the first one where I'm actually mixing a little bit of imaginary narratives along with documentary ones. It's also in my native language, which is very interesting for me to work because I haven't done too many things in my own language.
So this is a great transition to talk about your documentary film, Error 404, Trust Not Found, which you are developing as part of the Future Money cohort. So would love to just get a bird's eye view. What is the film that you're working on? What themes does it explore? And who are the collaborators that you're working with?
For sure. Well, we might change the name, and that's another thing. I think the working title is still Error 404, but I think the narrative is exactly how we started. That communities should have the absolute power to govern how technologies impact the societies. But I think the film kind of is about the imagination of a community that is deeply impacted by the long oppression that they experience. There's a few symbolic representation of natural objects and different systems in the society. So I think I haven't used symbology the way I have used in this film. And I think I'm very, very happy that the script and the narrative that I built in the beginning kind of match, which is basically how communities want to imagine their future. What is that they want when digital payments are made, or what are the other alternatives? How do we combine old and new? How do bartering system and other form of monetary transaction are combined with digital payment systems? It doesn't always have to be one system replacing entirely another system, but it could also be combination of different systems, the way things generally work in societies.
What have your learnings been, and has your kind of perspective shifted in terms of your understanding of how economies are transforming and the possibility of economies within the community that you're capturing?
I think there has definitely been a couple of different things that have shifted since I started. The original idea was to imagine how a marginalized community would imagine a technology to work for them. Over the process, it pushed me to think a little bit about oppression and the lack of honesty when it comes to discussions that are as complicated and difficult as oppression. Oftentimes, we've seen people with privileges talking about people without privileges. And even though many people don't want to do that, just the outcome results in underlying the very severe complex. So I think that has changed drastically in the entire process. And I'm very happy that happened because it allowed me to be more honest, and it allowed me to incorporate a lot of elements in the film that talk about the point of view of the oppressor, that it is the oppressor who is responsible for the oppression, and romanticizing oppression or romanticizing poverty porn, for example, is not the way forward. It has to be the other way. It has to be talking about the misery that the oppressors have brought to the world and how that has impacted and how that imagination would look like. A lot has been talked about this centerpiece, and we really wanted to not focus on that, the poverty porn. And I think just combining the hybrid approach where we are combining documentary filmmaking and imagination, which is speculative, allowed to do that. It would have been really, really hard to do that, especially because I couldn't travel to India myself and meet people, which I would have loved. But yeah, I think all these constraints helped in many ways.
What I see in your work is kind of a measure of what it looks like to take accountability through generative creativity. So like recognizing the hierarchical, like, and oppressive natures of like the caste system, for example, and the ways in which, like, you know, your people may be implicated in that, or what does it look like to form relationships with folks and center folks that are marginalized and don't really have mechanisms of empowerment, whether that's within economies or within social order. So I guess my last question to you, and you know, as we're thinking about future money and kind of visioning forward, I'm curious, like, for in your role as both somebody who is a documentarian and also passionate about you know, language, whether that's preservation or evolution, just your sense of like the relationship between language and economy, like from your vantage point, you know, what do you see as the possibility of continued work and community building around language, as well as visioning for the economy moving forward?
I think I'll start with saying that I've seen how the two important paradigms that have shifted a lot in the recent years. One is there's a lot of focus on localizing content and localizing platforms and UI when it comes to rolling out digital technologies, be it the very system called UPI, the Unified Payment Interface, that is an outcome of public-private partnership in India and is probably world's largest digital payment system that is in use right at the moment in terms of volume. Be the rollout of that, how many companies actually rolled out language, multilingual UI to make sure that people in different parts of the country would be able to use that and access. And they did see an increase of the user base because of that's one of the factors. That's one of the reasons why it saw that penetration. That's one of the paradigms. The second paradigm is there's a conscious understanding and sort of effort to teach people English in India, because English is no longer taught as a language of the colonists or language that was indeed used during colonization for more than 300 years. but it is now seen as a language of opportunity and a language that could actually liberate people from the local oppressions that they experience.
Yeah. And I guess what I'm hearing from you is that it's a both and process. It's never like the way forward is always choosing a type of plurality and a type of examination, and reclamation of indigenous origin and the insights therein. And then also ensuring that we move forward in a place where we can speak across languages, across cultures, and envision our future with money.
In the scope of this grant, I would love to know what financial inclusion means to you.
To me, it means that the financial inclusions, because it's different in different contexts, of course. So I'm deliberately using inclusions. But I think the financial inclusion would be a way to ensure that groups that have been historically marginalized, and particularly from an economic standpoint, have access to the know-how and means to be able to access money. People should be able to access or receive money easily. So that's very important. There have been historical barriers to receiving money in the first place. So I think starting from government regulations to platforms or mediums, and there are many ways people have been subjected to the barriers to receiving money. So I think removing those barriers is definitely one step towards financial inclusion. There are also many social factors that are responsible for people not being able to have access to money. So I think it's also important to look at those factors. Obviously, removing many of those systemic barriers are paramount for financial inclusion.
I would love to ask you this question, and that is, even if you come from a place of privilege, if you have any personal experiences with it.
Just from my own personal experience, back in 2019, maybe, I did not have Aadhaar, which is the Indian national ID, but it's kind of voluntary by law, but it's almost impossible to live in India without Aadhaar. And my bank basically froze my account, saying that I have not submitted Aadhaar. And for at least a month, I did not receive my salary, or I could not withdraw any money from my account. I couldn't do any transaction at all. And it was almost impossible to actually explain to the bank without taking the help of an expensive lawyer that I should be able to do all the transactions with the bank. And that's one kind of financial exclusion that I have faced.
For the people who are listening, could you explain more about Aadhaar and what are the requirements?
I actually made a documentary researching about it for a year. But I think Aadhaar was rolled out to capture a lot of personal data of residents in the country. And we're talking about more than 1.4 billion people. And when a government has access to that kind of data, then they are able to profile people. They're able to see, kind of have a 360-degree view of a citizen's everyday life. And so from a privacy and from a digital rights standpoint, there are many drawbacks, but to apply and get Aadhaar, it's quite easy. I mean, you go to an enrollment center, which is privately owned and privately operated. Sometimes there's a lot of data breach, how they basically share that data with the government once they capture it. But anyway, it's quite easy. It's quite simple and easy. One has to go to a center carrying 2 pieces of IDs. And then they click a picture, they take a couple of biometric data. So iris scan, a photograph of the face, fingerprints of all the fingers. So the biometric data is captured at the center, and that is saved in this massive data center, or the data centers now. And then you basically receive this digital ID. So it's a digital identification. One could claim that a lot of people are able to access things digitally now because everything is channeled through Aadhaar. And one could also share empirical data about how people are marginalized more than before because of Aadhaar. And that's something that I actually focused on in my documentary, that how people that have been historically marginalized are being marginalized more because of the rollout.
Well, it sounds like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's focus on the film, Bringing Down a Mountain, which premiered during the Interledger Summit. How does it align with financial inclusion?
I think Bringing Down a Mountain, the central theme of the film is around digital inclusion, but also reimagining how digital inclusion would look like in a society where we still have the caste system, we still have the social segregation, and there's oppression, and one really has to overcome a lot of those systemic barriers. And it is impossible, as I said before, to think about a place that is inclusive, a system that is inclusive, until those systemic barriers are removed. But that doesn't mean that technology wouldn't be rolled out. That doesn't mean that we'll have to wait for hundreds of years for any change to happen. Sometimes it also means that people have to take action, and people have to experiment. People have to ensure that those who are excluded also have the ability to decide for themselves. So I think it's also about creating awareness and creating sort of documentations and building basically know-how for people to decide for themselves. And I think the film definitely touch bases those themes, that we have to acknowledge what the status quo is, but that doesn't mean that we stop there. We move forward and think about how bringing down a system would look like, how abolition would look like in this context, and abolition of caste in this context, and then what that would mean for financial inclusion in sort of a post-digital era, or post-mobile transaction or mobile payment era.
Do you really believe in the abolition, or do you believe in the adjustment?
One really has to think radically so that the pragmatic changes would happen. If one think having the reservation that things would happen slowly and gradually and organically, then the actual changes would be even slower, because that's how things are in reality. That one really has to aim for everything that should be, that should end. But that doesn't mean that all those things would happen very, very soon, right? So, I'm thinking back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, when the founding father of India's constitution, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, was thinking about the abolition of caste. He was also aware that it would take a lot of time. And I think that's sort of is my stand as well, that I really want the abolition to happen. I really want to contribute for that. But I also know that I might not see that in my own lifetime. It might just happen many, many years later. It's sort of a collective responsibility for many people to contribute towards that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Subhashish, for that. And I think that ties into, I feel like I learned a lot as somebody who isn't as familiar with the Indian caste system, South Asia. I think the conversations that you and I were able to have in Costa Rica during the Interledger 2023 annual summit, in which your film was premiered, were really eye-opening for me personally, just especially as somebody who is American, has a very specific understanding of what abolition means, both a type of abolition that has been achieved on paper and then transmuted in a certain sense, whether that's like the abolition of slavery or talking about like more in a contemporary form abolition when it comes to our present prison industrial complex, and then thinking about how caste and its relationship to economic standing, and as you explained and opened my eyes to, digital access, and recognizing those things as one and the same, and not just only caste in impacting one's access to financial self-determination and technology, but also what you and I discussed was those intersecting and overlapping marginalizations that contributed to a furthering of the almost kind of like an exponential exclusion And so I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about that. I think with Bringing Down a Mountain, one statistic that really jumped out at me that you quoted in the film, and for those who haven't seen the film yet, the film is very poetic. It is not a documentary, and there's a lot of literal poetry that is woven throughout. But in the film, you state a very clear statistic, which is that 46% of all digital transactions globally are made in India, yet 66% of the population live in villages that may not have a stable connection or any connection at all to the internet. So to me, that one statistic alone really highlights how critical it is to understand India as a region and a population that not only has great kind of volume and power in a certain sense in terms of digital transactions, but also has a great disparity. And so within all of that, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that disparity, how you treat it in the film, and recognizing that, again, there's great power and connectivity and yet a great disparity in India's population.
The statistics often have to be translated with context. And I think in this case, one really has to look at the transactions, or the number of digital transactions in India, which is quite promising. It seems very positive. But I think on the other hand, just because somebody is using digital transactions doesn't mean that they have more access to money. It's just another medium of transaction. A lot of transactions used to happen in different ways, and now they're being tracked, and we know that these transactions are happening. That really doesn't change the status quo for majority of the people. So I think one really has to understand that very clearly, that digital transactions don't mean financial inclusion. Digital transactions just mean that there is a different mode of transaction, and that is more of a natural evolution of everything to me, that we are using technology more than we were using before. And a lot of things that were happening sort of in analog or physical forms are happening digitally now, and we're able to track, we are able to generate data. It would have been really hard to do that. And, it would have been really impossible actually to know how many people are using phones to a transaction. So I think, there's that. So I think the other part, what the film also explores, is the sort of ambiguity, where it's not very conclusive to say that things have radically changed, and there's digital transaction, and there's access to mobile data, or there's access to devices, or there's access to sort of know-how, and everything has changed. I think it kind of stops at a place where we say that people have now power. They have access to that sort of socioeconomic power that they never had, and they are deciding for themselves. They're exploring, and they're figuring out things for themselves. So it kind of ends there, saying that, there's just one mountain that's down, and there's another mountain a few miles ahead. What that means is that we are also not seeing sort of a magical utopia of evolution. It's happening in kind of sporadic ways, and because of that, we're seeing changes in some places, and there's definitely sort of a positive vibe. There's hope, there's effort to change the status quo of a community, but that doesn't mean that it has happened everywhere, that in the entire country or in all the places people have achieved that power that they never had. That is sort of a very conscious decision to keep that ambiguity. It's also in a way to say that we're not deciding for people here. We're thinking that this is going to be a decision that many people would take. Some people would want to do sort of mobile-based transactions. Some people might not. And it's a decision that people would take, and we should actually leave it there, that we are a complex society, and in a complex society, that's how things work. There's no uniformity in any manner, and there's no one system that would sort of be the system for any society. People would have that pluralism. People would have that multiple things going on at the same time. Some people would definitely use and switch entirely to digital transactions.
Well, thank you. But I do have a question. So what is the magic formula, according to you? I mean, what do you believe it should be?
No, I think it's not really that important what I believe or not. I think it's really important to know in this context, things wouldn't be uniform. And I'm saying this from my own limited understanding of a country like India, which is extremely diverse, extremely plural. In 100 kilometers, one would hear multiple completely disconnected languages. Just the topography of the country, and that's just one country. There are many other regions in the entire world where it would be really impossible to have one kind of system or sort of change the entire system. I think maybe if things are very homogeneous in a place, it might be a different thing altogether. If there is sort of a governance system that is so powerful that it could sort of change the regulation in a way that things would move to a different paradigm altogether. But I think in the context of India, it is really, really hard, if not impossible. And but again, as I said, digital transactions don't necessarily mean digital inclusion. Digital inclusion is a much more larger wish, desire, and a status quo that is definitely intended by many, and many are already working towards that. But I strongly feel that it would only come by sort of working in different layers. There's definitely the socioeconomic part, which is very, very important. And that's the systemic part, much difficult and time-taking to sort of address. And that would affect a lot of other things. And again, technology would take its own course, and we would see evolution of technology. Maybe one technology would surpass the other. And because of how regulations are made, how governments sort of control how technologies are rolled out in a country. In the context of India, UPI, the Unified Payment Interface, that has been promoted by the government for many years now. And the way it is promoted basically helps the government, helps a lot of private companies. So the public-private partnership has been very, very successful. And then one has to really look at how that has affected the market, the economy, and how the larger population, the majority of the people, how it has affected them. So one would basically see a tremendous increase in digital transactions. As I said, these are digital transactions. They don't necessarily mean that there's more inclusion now, just because the change in the process of how transactions are made has been done.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I appreciate you calling that out, because I think sometimes, there's this false correlation, right? Both between like, oh, if there's a high volume of digital transactions, then that must mean that it's a highly activated, population that has potentially like a lot of agency or more capital. But these statistics might be misleading when we think about overarchingly who has the power and who has the agency. And what I'm hearing from you, and I think is much aligned with what you shared with us previously about your own experience in open internet and open source technology, is that ultimately the end goal is not to prescribe what digital inclusion means for certain communities, especially those that are so diverse and different. It's really to allow people to have the tools and the access to determine what digital and financial inclusion looks like for them, and what design works best for their own particular communities, whether that's highly urban, highly rural, something in between. And I do kind of like the play on that where, your film talks about bringing down a mountain. It's not the mountain. It's not a monolithic understanding of removing a barrier and then the skies open up and it's this utopic, fantastic, happily ever after. Like that in and of itself is not realistic, nor is it something to be working towards. And I think it just reminds me during the Interledger Summit and the other Future Money artists that exhibited, we had the Resimulate project talking about, it's not just simulating the future, but recognizing that it's simultaneous futures, and that each person, to be authentic and to be genuine about what we understand the future to be, it's not just a singular future, but it's actually a simultaneous and multiple futures that each person is determining for themselves. And then I also think of Esther and John's project with Afrofuturist Village Banking, and how a lot of these banking entities or configurations and collectives were really against this very homogenized Western prescribed top-down understanding of what financial freedom, quote unquote, or financial agency, quote unquote, looked like for the global South. And recognizing that like what the World Bank prescribed was actually like a future of debt and not a future of financial inclusion and liberation. So a lot of those themes that each individual artistic project came into the summit with really do overlap and intersect with each other. And that's what I see in this film as well. So I guess moving forward, because of those things, like for you personally, do you have a sense in your, whether it's your community or the communities that you have been engaging with in this film, kind of a more specific understanding of digital inclusion? Like, what are those specific tools, those specific obstacles that you see, having done this film in this process, that you feel inspired by or that you hope to see moving forward in the future?
Well, I think for the communities that I have been involved with for the longest time, including my own, and the film, of course, is in the language that I speak or the language that I write. I speak in a different dialect at home. That's a different thing. My own community and my neighboring communities that I have been involved for the longest time with, I think for them, it's different things, because within those communities, there is also, I mean, one really has to look at the intersectionality, right? There's sort of a very popular sort of explanation that one would come across while reading about India from a socioeconomic standpoint, which basically goes like this. If we think of a Dalit woman, Dalit communities are basically a heterogeneous community. So there are many different ethnic races, there are many different faith systems, there are many different geographical locations where the Dalit communities live, and that together are called one community. So it's a sort of a political framing in that sense. But the Dalit communities have historically been the most marginalized, the most oppressed community by the dominant caste communities in India. So, and then to move forward, what I was starting with is that a woman from a Dalit community is often triple oppressed. First, because she is Dalit. Second, because she doesn't have access to financial power. And third, because she is a woman. And being a woman, she's oppressed within her own family, within her own society, because the society itself is a very patriarchal society. And because she's a woman, she's also oppressed outside of her home. When she goes to a workplace, or it's mostly an informal workplace, she's often oppressed because she's from a Dalit community and she's a woman. So historically, the Dalit women have been subjected to more sexual violence at their informal workplaces. And these are all inorganized informal workplaces. There is no wage system. There is no sort of labor right. There is no unionizing. There's basically no access to all those things that give somebody some amount of job security and security in general, safety and security in general. So I was mentioning that because I wanted to talk about the intersectionality that is very, very relevant here. So I think to me, or to the communities that I know of, for them, financial inclusion would basically mean that it's different for different people that are able to go to school and access some form of education, be it basic education, be it higher education, are literate. So they definitely would be able to jump very quickly to all things digital. And for everyone else, it would come at a slower pace. For some people, it would be faster. Say those who are sort of first generation learners, those who are getting to study for the first time in their family, or go to school for the first time in their family. And if they're able to get higher education, if they have a job, and they have to use digital systems, digital transactions included, they would definitely be using different forms of digital transactions. And I'm sure they would also prefer digital transactions over other forms of transactions because it's always convenient to use things that are digital for most people that have access, right? So it always comes with that clause. As long as one has access, if there's less connectivity, if there's no connectivity, if there's no know-how, then things would be very, very different, quite the opposite.
But you don't believe that this access, especially for these women, is kind of like creates agency as well?
It does. And that's something that's very interesting, because the same technology that could exclude somebody could also bring inclusion to many.
Have you seen that firsthand as well, kind of like the change or how it has like influenced a person's life?
For sure. Many vendors use digital payment systems now. And I've seen people, in fact, today I was making a small transaction and I didn't have cash. So I had to use UPI to make that transaction. And the person I was making that transaction to could only recognize the numbers and understand that much. He doesn't know how to read in English. So in the entire UI, in the entire interface, the only thing that he could recognize is the numbers. But he was able to sort of understand the transaction, that I'm paying the right amount, or I'm making a payment and he has to show me the QR code so I could scan it using my phone and make a payment. Just using that system is definitely bringing some form of understanding of how this digital payment system works.
Subhashish, you premiered your film at the Interledger Summit, and your film was part of the Future Money Open Studios. And I'm curious just how the experience of premiering and also just being a part of the Interledger community, both the Future Money artists as well as the larger Interledger community, was for you, both just your general learnings, but more specifically towards a more like systems level understanding of financial inclusion and financial equity. I would just love to hear any thoughts you had and takeaways that you had from your summit experience.
Yeah, I think premiering the film at the Interledger Summit was definitely amazing. I got to hear from a lot of people, both present at the premiere, but also those who walked into the Future Money space. And I think the interaction was extremely engaging, but also quite inspiring for me to also think about other facets, to think about other areas that one really could think about when it comes to financial inclusion and sort of reimagining what it means for different communities. So I think it was definitely rewarding in that sense. There were a lot of people that also appreciated that I've used only openly licensed media for making the film, or use of many openly licensed or open source software, also releasing the film under an open license. So I think there's definitely sort of openness within the community, within the Interledger community, that I've seen over many years now. And I think with that also comes sort of the pillars of open source, or the values that come with the open source, which is basically creating something that's open, that's interoperable, and there's more documentation, and there's always scope for forking and sharing and creating versions and localizing. So I think those are sort of the values that exist within the community. People are more open to hearing how things are on the other side. I think when things are proprietary and there's just one way of doing things, it's always hard, if not impossible, to move forward, because it kind of captures the viewpoint of only a few, and only the most privileged few. So I think, yeah, there's definitely that kind of openness within the Interledger community that I've seen.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing that. So as we wind down our conversation today, I'm curious, I heard a little whisper that there might be a next chapter for your film with the Library of Congress or some sort of institutional moment. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that is? Because I truly am in the dark.
Yeah, sure. So I think the Library of Congress acquires books, digital publications every year in their regional offices. The South Asia office that's located in New Delhi, India, obviously acquires from the entire region. So all the countries in the region, where they have presence. And they would like to actually watch the film first. So I'm sending a DVD to them, and they're going to watch and then decide about acquiring a copy of the film. But I think it's quite rewarding if it actually gets acquired by the Library of Congress, because I'm going to be very happy if that happens.
That's exciting. Yeah. And I will say, just having been able to watch the film several times and had conversations with you about it, I do feel it's a piece that can be at home in an art museum and be at home in a financial think tank. Like, I think the film really bridges a lot of themes and brings an artfulness and a poetry to what's often a very dry and statistics-driven conversation, and brings, a type of vibrancy and vitality to a conversation that's often devoid of personality, and frankly, that ambiguity that you spoke of. So I'm excited for its next steps into unlikely institutions. I'll pass it to my fantastic co-host for a final question before we conclude our conversation.
Thank you, Alice. If you could think, or not think, if you're allowed to let yourself dream, let's start with that. What do you believe would be a financially equitable future globally? And it's not like that you eradicate your personal belief or anything like that, but just if you could dream, like, what would be your utopia?
Well, I think I'm imagining a future where there's more access to education, because that itself could transform societies, that itself could give a lot of power to people. And I think when there's more education, and I'm saying education in a very abstract sense here, but I think it is sort of self-explanatory. When there's access to education, people are able to learn things that interest them, and things that are part of their daily life. People definitely would like to learn about things. So I think a lot of people that I've spoken to in over the years that have actually come from different marginalized communities have shared how education has changed things for them, and how they're able to help many others in their own community, their fellow community members. So I think people, just by having access to education, become these sort of superheroes. And I really want to see more superheroes in communities that have been historically marginalized. I mean, if I really want to dream of a utopia, I really want to see as many superheroes as possible, right? So that's where things get more distributed. And I'm talking about distribution of leadership and distribution of power, money, all of those things. And I truly believe that digital technology could play an important role, a catalyst role there. And I really want to see that. The goal is to have more financial inclusion. And if I'm imagining that way, I think digital technology would play an important role there in many ways and in many forms. There would be a lot of old systems that would continue to exist, but there would be also new ways to reimagine things. And I think that's very important, that as a society, as a large society, we are moving forward and we're using things that are available to us. But I think if the technologies themselves are not available to people, just the existence of technology doesn't mean that they're available to all the people. I think I would really want that to change, that people have access to the technology, not because it is open source. I mean, being open source is very, very important. It's very critical, in fact. But because they have access to education and they know more about things, they're able to learn. They have the time and affordability and the opportunity to learn. I think that's something that I really want to see as a change.
I think that's a very important and valuable change, because then you would build a society of critical thinkers, but also dreamers, and then art workers.
Yeah.
Thank you, Subhashish, for answering this question. It's a very beautiful answer.
So, Subhashish, we're so elated to have you as part of the Future Money cohort. We're really excited to see the film that you've made. I'm really looking forward to, as somebody who comes from a poetic background, to know that you have been synthesizing your documentarian approach and your framework of technological advancement with the work of a progressive activist poet. So I'm thrilled to see how that comes to life.
Thank you, both of you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Subhashish, on the Future Money podcast. And we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you. Look forward to seeing you too.
To learn more about the Internet Foundation, visit our website where you can find all of the published episodes
and more information on our guests, our grant programs, and Interledger resources.